Every Christian apologist has it memorized. 4 sentences in Josephus, the only ancient mention of Jesus outside the Bible by a Roman-era historian. Spinoza spent years on those 4 sentences. What he found has been quietly set aside ever since. Every time the historical existence of Jesus comes up in a serious conversation, not a theological conversation, not one about divinity or resurrection, but the basic historical question of whether a man named Jesus of Nazareth existed and was executed in first-century Judea. The argument tends to come down to one thing: the Testimonium Flavianum, 4 sentences, in the Antiquities of the Jews, Book 18. Written, it is claimed, by Flavius Josephus, a Jewish historian writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, non-Christian, non-partisan, a Roman citizen who had no theological interest in the survival of Christianity. That is the argument. Not a gospel, not a letter produced by the church for the church. An outside voice, writing for a Roman audience, recording what happened. Every serious Christian apologist I have encountered in 30 years has it in their arsenal. The moment you raise questions about the reliability of the gospel accounts, about the late composition of the canonical texts, about the theological motivations of the early church, the testimonium appears. Josephus said it. Not a Christian, a Jew, writing in the 1st century. End of argument. I have watched that move work. In academic debates, in popular discussions, in the corridors of conferences, the Testimonium Flavianum functions as a stopper, something you press into the neck of the bottle to seal what would otherwise be an uncomfortable conversation. And the question Spinoza asked about those 4 sentences is one that took me years to sit with properly. Not, is it convenient? Not, does it help? But, is it genuine? Does it say what it says? Or does it say what someone at some point needed it to say? I want to show you what the evidence shows, step by step, each layer on its own merits, because the answer does not come from one piece of evidence. It comes from several pieces of evidence, independent of each other, arriving from different centuries, in different languages, all pointing in the same direction. I will show you exactly how Spinoza identified the mechanism. But first, you need to understand what those 4 sentences actually say, and who wrote the words around them. Before you can examine the testimonium, you need to understand who Josephus was, because the argument for the text's authenticity rests heavily on his identity, and the argument against it rests on exactly the same thing. Josephus was born in Jerusalem, around 37 of the Common Era, roughly the generation after the events the testimonium describes. He was a priest from a prominent family, educated in all 3 major Jewish schools of thought. He served as a military commander in the Jewish revolt against Rome, was captured in 67 of the Common Era, and did something that defined the rest of his life. He switched sides. He offered the Roman general Vespasian a prophecy that Vespasian would become emperor. Vespasian did. Josephus was released, given a Roman name, and spent his remaining decades writing in Rome under Flavian patronage. His Antiquities of the Jews was produced for a Roman audience, aimed at explaining Jewish history and culture in terms that sophisticated Greco-Roman readers would understand. He was not a neutral party. He was a man who had abandoned his people in their worst hour and spent his remaining years justifying that choice to the empire that employed him. He was also not a Christian. There is no evidence anywhere in his writings that he was sympathetic to the Jesus movement or the early church. Now, the Testimonium Flavianum. As it appears in every surviving manuscript of Antiquities, the passage reads, in translation, "There was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. For he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the 3rd day. As the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him, and the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day." Now, before I go any further, there is something you need to know about the man who wrote the words surrounding that passage. Josephus across the 20 volumes of Antiquities, has a consistent voice. He is precise, slightly formal, sometimes self-justifying, always writing with a Roman audience in mind. He explains Jewish terminology. He qualifies Jewish theological claims for readers who have no context for them. When he discusses the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, he tells his Roman reader what these groups are and what they believe. He does not assume familiarity with Jewish religious categories. Now read this phrase from the Testimonium again. He was the Christ. The word Christ means the Anointed One. It is a specifically Jewish messianic title with enormous theological and political weight. For a Roman reader, encountering it in a historical text without explanation, it is very nearly meaningless. For a Jewish writer who is not a Christian, using it as a simple, unqualified attributive declaration, it is extraordinary. Josephus spends pages elsewhere explaining Jewish concepts to his Roman audience. Yet here, in the most theologically loaded sentence he ever supposedly wrote, there is no explanation. He was the Christ, as though the reader already knows what that means and already accepts the claim it makes. There are 3 problems with the Testimonium Flavianum. I want to take you through them in order. The third one is the one that closes the argument. The first problem is internal. Later in Antiquities, in Book 20, approximately 2 decades of text after the Testimonium, Josephus mentions a man named James who was executed. He identifies him as the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ. Not Jesus the Christ, not he was the Christ. Jesus who was called Christ. The qualifier is right there. The careful distancing phrase, who was called, is exactly what you would expect from a non-Christian historian identifying a person to a reader who had already encountered that name. It is neutral. It is measured. It is the register of someone who is not making a theological declaration. 2 different formulations. In Book 18, he was the Christ. In Book 20, who was called Christ. The second is how Josephus writes. The first is how a believer writes. Something about those 2 phrases cannot have been written by the same person with the same mind. I had read the Testimonium many times before I read it as a linguist. The first time I read it with genuine attention to the language, not to what it claimed, but to how it was written, was in a reading room in the north of England, early 1990s. North-facing windows. The flat, even light of a winter morning that never quite brightens into warmth. The kind of gray that academic libraries in that part of the country seem specifically designed to produce. The building was heating itself against the cold in the small clicks and settling adjustments of old pipes. I was working through a critical edition of Josephus's Greek for a translation seminar, the kind of close reading where you trace vocabulary against the surrounding corpus, note the patterns, build up a sense of how a particular mind writes when it is at full stretch. I reached the Testimonium. I had encountered it in translation many times. Every theology student meets it early and is given it as a gift. Here is your external confirmation. Here is your non-Christian source. But that morning, I was reading Josephus, not reading about Jesus. And somewhere in the 3rd sentence of the Testimonium, the texture of the Greek changed, not dramatically, not with the bluntness of an obvious insertion. But the vocabulary in those 4 sentences sat differently against the pages I had read before them, as though a few sentences had been composed by someone whose Greek came from a different century, a different set of reading habits, a different frame of reference entirely. I set the book flat on the desk. The north-facing light was the same flat, colorless gray. The thermos of tea I had brought was already cold. I had forgotten to drink it. I wrote 3 words in my notepad. Inconsistent vocabulary. Verify. Then I sat for a moment looking at those words, the heating pipes ticking once more in the wall behind me, before I continued. It took me years to return to that notation properly, but the question was there from that morning, in 3 words, in a cold reading room, next to a thermos I had neglected. Now consider the phrase, the divine prophets. Josephus refers across Antiquities to the prophets, the Jewish prophets, the books of the prophets. The specific formulation, the divine prophets, used to identify the Hebrew scriptures as anticipating the arrival of Jesus, is not his language. It is the language of Christian writers reading the Hebrew Bible through the lens of the Incarnation. Josephus has no such lens. He would not use it. And then, the tribe of Christians. In Greek, phylon ton Christianon, the word phylon. Josephus has a consistent vocabulary for religious or ideological groups. Heresis, a school, a sect, a way of life defined by shared practice. He uses heresis for the Pharisees, for the Sadducees, for the Essenes, systematically and reliably. He does not use phylon, which means tribe or race, a category of biological descent, to describe a group defined by shared religious conviction. Not anywhere else in his work. The word does not belong to his vocabulary for this kind of grouping, and so far this could perhaps be explained away. Unusual phrasing, interpolation of a phrase or two, a scribe who added a word, until you read what a very specific man wrote in the year 240. Here is what most people do not know. Because the internal inconsistency of the Testimonium with Josephus's own register is interesting, it raises the question. It does not answer it. What begins to answer it is a 3rd century scholar who never read the Testimonium at all. Origen of Alexandria. He is, without reasonable contest, the most formidable Christian scholar of his era. He was a prolific writer, a serious linguist, a man who produced a 6-column parallel text of the Hebrew Bible, and whose commentaries on Scripture were treated as standard reference materials for generations. He is also a man who cited Josephus repeatedly. In at least 3 of his major works, he refers to Josephus's Antiquities, draws on Josephus's historical accounts, uses Josephus as corroboration for events mentioned in the Gospels. Origen knew Josephus's Antiquities. He had read it. He cited it with evident familiarity. And in Contra Celsum, his extended apologetic defense of Christianity, written around 248 of the Common Era, Origen discusses the James passage in Josephus, identifies it, and adds an explicit qualification about what Josephus believed. In his own words, Origen describes Josephus as someone who did not believe in Jesus as the Christ. Josephus, who did not believe in Jesus as the Christ. Read that sentence again. If the Testimonium Flavianum, in the form it currently appears in every surviving manuscript of Antiquities, had been in Origen's copy of Josephus, Origen could not have written those words. He would have been explicitly contradicting a text he had just used as a reference. The Testimonium says, without qualification, he was the Christ. If Origen had that passage open before him, he would not have described Josephus as someone who did not believe Jesus was the Christ. That would have been a factual error in a passage where precision was essential. The only coherent explanation is that the Testimonium, in its current form, did not exist in Origen's copy of Antiquities. What I'm about to show you doesn't just challenge the Testimonium. It challenges the entire structure of the argument built on it, because if Origen's text of Josephus did not contain the Testimonium in 240, then the Testimonium was inserted after 240. And that means the question is not whether it was altered. The question is when and by whom and under what circumstances. Origen's testimony establishes the window. The Testimonium in its current form did not exist before 240. That is not an interpretation. It is what Origen's own words require. Origen's testimony is just the beginning. Now I need to show you the manuscript problem, and that one is frankly worse. The first time the Testimonium appears in its current form, in any document we can date, is in the work of Eusebius of Caesarea, his ecclesiastical history, written around 312 to 313 of the Common Era. Eusebius quotes the Testimonium in full. He cites it again in subsequent works. He is the origin point of the documentary record. Now think about who Eusebius was. He was the official historian of the court of Constantine. He wrote the biography of Constantine. He presided over the Council of Nicaea in 325. He was, in the literal and professional sense, the most motivated man in the ancient world to find a non-Christian historical confirmation of Jesus. His entire theological and political project depended on establishing Christianity as an ancient faith with genuine historical roots in the 1st century. A 1st century Jewish historian confirming the existence of Jesus, the crucifixion, the resurrection. This was exactly what his project required, The man who first quotes the Testimonium is also the man with the greatest possible motive to invent it. I'll come back to that. But there is something more structurally damaging than motive. There is the manuscript problem. Every surviving Greek manuscript of Josephus's Antiquities of the Jews derives from a single family of texts, not from multiple independent lines that happen to agree. From one transmission lineage, passing through the Byzantine scriptoria of the medieval period. The oldest surviving Greek manuscript of Antiquities dates to approximately the 9th or 10th century of the Common Era, 8 or 9 centuries after Josephus wrote. In all of those manuscripts, all descending from the same medieval ancestor, the Testimonium appears. If that medieval ancestor contained the interpolation, every descendant would carry it. There is no independent manuscript tradition that could correct the error, no parallel line of transmission to expose the difference. One stream, one ancestor, one point of failure. Between Origen in 240 and Eusebius in 313, there is a window of 73 years. That is the space into which someone could have introduced this passage, and by the mechanism of medieval manuscript transmission, made it permanent. I was at a conference in the north of England, one of those patristics gatherings that take place in slightly cold institutional buildings with hospitality urns of indifferent tea between sessions. The corridor was emptying as people moved toward the next room. The man I found myself talking to had spent 3 decades working on Eusebius, not peripheral work, genuinely major published scholarship on Eusebian historiography, the kind that shakes how the field reads the 4th century. We had been discussing the Testimonium, specifically the question of its provenance. He set down his paper cup on a side table with some deliberateness, looked along the corridor rather than at me, and said with the careful even-handedness of someone choosing words with professional precision, "No serious scholar of Josephus that I know personally treats the Testimonium as authentic in its current form. The academic question is not whether it was interpolated. It is how much of the original text survives underneath what was added." He paused. "Then, you will understand why that does not appear in the standard reference works used in seminaries." He picked up his cup. He moved toward the next session. I stood in that corridor for a moment after he had gone, holding a paper cup of cooling tea, with the particular quality of silence that follows a sentence that says more than the words it contains. The 48 words he had spoken to me in that corridor did not appear in any of the 3 books of his that I owned. I want to be precise about what has been established before we go further, because the next evidence is the most difficult to answer. The origin argument tells us the Testimonium was inserted after 240. The manuscript argument tells us there is no independent Greek textual tradition capable of detecting or correcting that insertion. One ancestor, one stream, no second line of transmission to expose the error. What I am about to show you comes from entirely outside the Greek tradition, preserved in Arabic and Syriac, languages not subject to the same Byzantine transmission. And what it shows is not ambiguous. It shows that a more neutral version of this passage existed and was progressively altered into the one that appears in every Bible commentary you have ever read. This is not a matter of scholarly interpretation about what words might mean. It is a matter of comparing 2 texts in 2 languages and reading what they say. What makes the next part difficult is not that it is uncertain. What makes it difficult is how clear it is. And then, in 1971, something happened that changed the framing of this debate permanently. A scholar named Shlomo Pines, working on Arabic language historical chronicles, published an analysis of a passage in a 10th century Arabic Christian historian named Agapius of Hierapolis. Agapius had written a universal history in Arabic, a text largely overlooked in the Western scholarly tradition, and he had included a version of the Josephus passage about Jesus, not the standard Testimonium, a different version. Here in translation is what Agapius records. At this time there was a wise man who was called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. And those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion, and that he was alive. Accordingly, He was perhaps the Messiah concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders. He was perhaps the Messiah. Not he was the Christ. Perhaps. An entirely different claim, a hedged formulation, the kind of qualified, careful observation a non-Christian historian might actually make when writing about a figure his followers considered to be the anointed one predicted by their scriptures. Perhaps, where a later Christian scribe, for whom no perhaps whatsoever was possible, would write was, a 12th century Syriac Christian chronicler named Michael the Syrian has a version of the same passage that is also notably more neutral than the standard Greek text. The convergence of these independent traditions, Arabic Agapius, Syriac Michael, suggests that a more measured version of the passage was in circulation, consistent with what a non-Christian first-century historian might actually have written, and that this more measured version was subsequently amplified, helped towards certainty that the original text did not claim. The Arabic version tells us something crucial. What Josephus may have originally written is very different from what appears in your Bible commentary. A hedged, neutral observation about a historical figure, not a declaration of faith, not a theological statement. And the process by which the hedged version became the declaratory version is exactly what Spinoza's method predicts. In the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, Spinoza described a mechanism with great precision. He argued that ecclesiastical writers of the 4th century understood it as an act of piety, as a form of religious duty, to complete texts that should have contained certain truths. To help texts say what, given who wrote them and when, they must surely have been intended to say. Not falsification in the fraudulent sense, something more institutionally systematic, the filling in of spaces where the tradition required completeness that the document did not yet provide. The process Spinoza identified was not unique to one text. It was a practice, spread across 4th century ecclesiastical production. The conviction that providence could not have left a gap in the documentary record, that where the record was silent on something that must have been true, the silence was a deficiency in the record, not in history, and that a careful, faithful scholar could in good conscience fill it. Not invent, complete. The distinction mattered enormously to the people who did it. It matters considerably less to historians reading the result. When you look at the Testimonium against the Agapius version, you can see the editing with unusual clarity. Perhaps the Messiah was the Christ. The disciples' report, they reported that he had appeared to them, became an asserted fact. He appeared to them alive. The tribe entered the text where no such formulation had been. Each change is small. Individually, each is almost defensible. Together, they moved the text from the register of a cautious first-century Jewish historian into the register of a confident 4th-century Christian apologist. The hand that went in left traces in every word it changed. Spinoza described this mechanism in general terms. He did not know about the Testimonium specifically. His work predates Pines' discovery by 3 centuries, but the Testimonium, in the light of Agapius, is a case study in precisely what Spinoza described. A more neutral text exists. A more rhetorically useful text replaced it. Between the two, you can see the editing. You can see where the hand went in. In a moment, I'll show you the exact Greek words that Josephus could not have written. Words that, when you examine them against his known corpus, belong to a different century and a different pen. There are scholars who have done this work with rigorous precision. A researcher working in the late 1990s, a scholar named Ken Olson, publishing in the Harvard Theological Review in 1999, made an argument that went further than most were prepared to accept. His claim was not that the Testimonium had been partially interpolated. His claim was that when you examined the vocabulary and phrasing of the Testimonium against the full surviving corpus of Josephus on one side and the full surviving corpus of Eusebius on the other, the passage reads like Eusebius. Not in the sense of a casual resemblance, in the sense of a detailed linguistic fingerprint, the specific terminology, the rhetorical patterns, the vocabulary choices. They align with Eusebius's known writing practices, not with Josephus's. Not every scholar accepts that conclusion. Alice Wheely, whose work on the transmission history of the Testimonium is among the most careful in the field, argues for partial interpolation, that a genuine neutral reference to Jesus existed in Josephus and was progressively expanded. The Agapius version as evidence of the earlier, less theologically loaded form. The Greek text of Antiquities as evidence of what it became. The scholarly consensus, to the extent one exists, clusters around this partial interpolation position. Something real, subsequently amended. But whether the interpolation is partial or total, the structural fact does not change. The 4 sentences cited in debates and sermons and encyclopaedias as the definitive non-Christian confirmation of Jesus are not what Josephus wrote. The question is only how much was added. I need to tell you something personal, because the question of what to do with evidence of this kind is not purely academic for me. It took me a long time to understand that. I was a student of theology in Norwich, the late 1980s. I had been an Anglican my whole life, choir as a boy, confirmed in my teens, undergraduate in religious studies, now working simultaneously toward academic qualification and toward ordination, reading widely the way students do when they are still forming their understanding of how things fit together. One autumn afternoon, I was working through Spinoza's Tractatus Theologico Politicus. The lamp on my desk gave that particular yellowish light that older lamps produce, the color of warmth rather than brightness. There was wind at the window, the specific argumentative quality of East Anglian autumn wind, which insists against glass rather than simply passing it. I had a cup of tea that had gone cold at my elbow while I read. I came to the passage where Spinoza discusses the practices of 4th century ecclesiastical writers. He describes a specific phenomenon with precision. He says that writers of that period understood it as an act of piety to complete texts that should have contained certain truths. To help texts say what, given their supposed origin, they were surely intended to say. Not fraud, in the conscious adversarial sense. Something more systematic, institutional. The responsible finishing of what divine providence must have begun. I read that and stopped, because I had been taught the Testimonium Flavianum in my first year of undergraduate study. It was one of the first pieces of external evidence I had ever been given for the historical Jesus. One of my tutors had presented it directly, confidently. Here is what a contemporary non-Christian historian wrote. Here is your external confirmation. I had stored it. I had cited it. I had felt, when I cited it, the particular confidence that comes from having a fact on your side. Sitting there with the Tractatus open, and the lamp yellow, and the wind at the window, I asked myself for the first time, had I ever read the Testimonium in Greek, and asked whether it sounded like Josephus? Had I ever brought to it the kind of attention Spinoza insisted every text deserved, every word in its historical moment? Does this word belong here? I had not. The question sat with me for the rest of that evening without resolution. Over the following weeks, I began checking. I went back to the Greek. I went back to the James passage in Book 20. I found Origen's reference. The faith framework did not collapse. It redistributed. Something I had been treating as load-bearing turned out to be built on material that someone else had mixed in a different century for reasons I could understand but could not endorse. The structure stood, but it stood differently. I'm not sure I've ever quite found the right word for what that experience was. It was not anger. It was not grief. It was the specific disorientation of discovering that something you had been confidently handing to other people, something you had offered as solid ground, was ground that someone else had quietly laid over in absence, and you had never looked down. So where does this leave us? Is there any genuine ancient mention of Jesus outside the Christian tradition at all? The answer is yes, but not the one the apologists use. There are 2 other passages in Josephus that are relevant. The passage about John the Baptist in Book 18 is long, detailed, and entirely uncontested by scholars. Josephus treats John as a significant historical and political figure in his own right. His execution by Herod Antipas created political complications that Josephus considers worth explaining at length. There is no theological reason for Josephus to say anything positive about John, and yet the account is substantial and apparently genuine. John existed. He had followers. His death had political consequences. And then there is the James passage, the one in Book 20 that uses the careful qualifier who was called Christ. Most scholars, including scholars who doubt the Testimonium entirely, treat the James passage as genuine Josephine material. It is consistent with his register. It uses the distancing formulation of a non-believer, identifying a figure by what his followers called him. It makes historical sense in context. And what it actually tells you, if it is genuine, is precise and limited. Josephus was aware of a person named Jesus, who was associated with messianic expectation by his followers, and who had a brother named James who was executed. That is not the Testimonium. That is not he was the Christ and appeared alive on the third day. That is a passing reference in a passage about someone else, offered as an identifying detail, in a register entirely consistent with a non-Christian first-century historian. Think about what that means for the apologetic argument. For decades, every time someone has cited the Testimonium in a debate or a sermon or a published book, they have been citing a text that most specialists in the field privately acknowledge was not written by Josephus in its current form. The James passage, which is rarely cited precisely because it says so much less, is what the evidence actually supports. A historical figure associated with messianic expectation by his followers. A brother named James. An execution. That is the flaw, not the edifice built on it. The flaw, and what remains when the fabricated evidence is removed, is both less dramatic and, I think, more honest. The institutional response to scholarship about the Testimonium has been, as my colleague in the conference corridor suggested, careful. I'll put it that way. Popular apologetics continues to cite it as definitive. Seminary textbooks often acknowledge the scholarly debate and then proceed to treat the text as at least partially reliable, without dwelling on what partial reliability actually does to the argument built on it. Olson's paper in the Harvard Theological Review was not widely discussed in popular Christian media. Pines' discovery of the Agapius version received serious scholarly attention and almost no popular notice at all. There is a particular quality to that silence. It is not hostile, it is not anxious, it is careful. The kind of quiet that comes not from a decision to suppress, but from an institutional recognition that some questions, if examined directly, cannot be answered in ways that are useful. Spinoza wrote something I have thought about many times since that Norwich afternoon. The only text that can survive rigorous examination is one written with the intention of conveying truth, not with the intention of persuading. The Testimonium Flavianum does not pass that test, not in its current form. It was written or substantially rewritten by someone who needed it to be persuasive, who needed it to confirm what was being contested, who understood that a neutral Jewish historian saying he was the Christ would carry more rhetorical weight than 100 Christian texts saying the same thing, and who at some point in the 73 years between Origen not finding it and Eusebius quoting it 4 times, made that happen. What remains when you remove it is fragmentary and ambiguous and genuinely historical in the way that authentic historical records are, partial, indirect, filtered through people with their own interests and limitations. The James passage, the John the Baptist passage, fragments that suggest a real person without confirming a theology. I have thought about that Norwich afternoon many times since. The lamp, the cold tea, the particular sound of the East Anglian wind against the window. What I remember most clearly is not the discovery. It was years before I fully understood the implications. What I remember is the question, the first honest question I had ever asked about a text I believed I already knew. Had I ever actually looked at this? Had I ever applied to it what Spinoza applied to everything? Every word in its historical moment. Does this word belong here? The answer that evening was no, not properly. I had accepted as solid a text I had never genuinely examined. The faith that depends on the Testimonium needs a fact it cannot have. The faith that can survive without it, that does not require the external confirmation to have been manufactured, is built on something harder to hold, but more honest to hold. Spinoza spent years on 4 sentences. What he found was not that Jesus did not exist. What he found was that the argument built on those 4 sentences cannot hold the weight that has been placed on it. Strip away what was added. Read what remains. Then decide what you think. That is a harder question than the one the Testimonium pretends to answer, but it is the actual question. I'll see you in the next one.
If you made it to the end, you're one of the few who really wants the truth. Write truth in the comments. It's how I know you're here for the right reasons, and it helps this reach others who need to hear it.